So thank you all for joining Alexandria Library in its celebration of Women's History Month. My name is Megan Zimmerman, and I'm an adult services librarian with the Alexandria Library, and I'm very glad that you've joined us for tonight's fascinating presentation. We have a couple of other events going on throughout Women's History Month. On Saturday, March 9th at 2 p.m. at the Beatley Library, they'll be doing a Barbie-themed game. On Saturday, March 16th at 1 p.m. at the Duncan Branch, they'll be holding a workshop on writing difficult truths in fiction, specifically focusing on women's truths. On Monday, March 18th at 7 p.m., there'll be a virtual program, The Social and Political Role of American Sewing Circles. And then on Wednesday, March 27th at the Duncan Branch at 6 p.m., they'll be working on making DIY care kits, and these will be personal belongings and toiletries and things like that, the items that will be donated for the domestic violence program in Alexandria. Tonight's presentation is on the Occoquan suffrage prisoners, and we're very lucky to have with us Alice Reagan to present. Alice is a native of Deerfield in upstate New York and has taught history at Northern Virginia Community College, Woodbridge, for 32 years. She serves as a docent and consultant at the Lucy Burns Museum at Lorton, which she helped found. In 2022, she was named Professor Emerita of History. She is a co-author with Kanina Spalding of the Lorton Prisons, Images of America book that was published in 2023. Alice, I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm very looking forward to what you have to share with us.
Okay, well, thank you. We're going to start out by defining some terms, okay, before we do some other things. First of all, the difference between a suffragist and a suffragette, okay? The terms often kind of get confused. Suffragists are generally women here in America, okay, who are pushing to get the vote. And this included all suffragists, okay? Not just the folks we're going to talk about tonight who are kind of radical, but the other folks too, okay? The more conservative folks led by Carrie Chapman Catt. Now, the term suffrage actually is an old term, comes from England. And in fact, it appears for the first time in 14th century in England. So it's been around for a long time. And basically, the term suffragette, which you probably heard, was a term in England. It was for the more radical suffragists in England. They did some pretty radical things. They threw rocks through people's windows. They threw eggs at the prime minister, although quite frankly, he kind of had it coming, if you ask me. He's kind of stuffy. They also trashed a mummy case in the British Museum. And they poured acid on golf courses. They generally were kind of vandals. And the American suffragists didn't do that, okay? So again, why is there a difference? Well, part of it is the British media, the newspapers, come up with this term suffragist as a kind of derogatory term, belittling term for the radical suffragists. And you got to remember at the time that the women are pushing for the vote in England, so too are a lot of men. In England, for the men, they kind of handed out, they kind of gave suffrage depending on what your class was. England's always been very much more class society than we are. And so you got to remember that. Now, here are the leaders of the suffragettes in England, the Pankhursts. The Pankhursts are the radicals, Emmeline, Christabel, and Sylvia. They helped inspire some of what Alice and the National Women's Party were going to do. But Alice and the Women's Party always said, we don't want to do the really kind of violent things that Emmeline and her friends did. Let's talk about the colors. So I always get a lot of questions at the museum about the colors. Now, the British women, particularly the radical women like the Pankhursts, had the Women's Social and Political Union, that was their organization, and they had these three colors. Some of this looks familiar. The purple is for loyalty and dignity. The white is for purity, and the green was for hope and for spring. So that's what the colors in the women's flag in England stood for. And actually, this flag was used in New York by some of the New York suffragists too. But you're probably more familiar with this. This is the National Women's Party flag here in the United States that Alice and her friends came up with. Purple, loyalty and also steadfastness to a cause. White was purity, and gold was light and life. And also it honored the first women's suffrage campaign in Kansas, where the sunflower came to be sort of the symbol of the suffragists in Kansas. And again, even today, the sunflower is used in a lot of things by the National Women's Party. So that just explains suffragist, suffragette, and also the different flags that people always ask us about. Now, in 1912, Woodrow Wilson became president of the United States. Wilson's a very conservative fellow when it comes to suffrage. He believes that it's up to the states to figure out who gets to vote. He is a good Democrat, late 19th, early 20th century Democrat. Remember, when we get to the New Deal, the Democrats and Republicans switch off on who is activists and who isn't, okay? And Wilson, as I said, definitely believes the states need to take care of this issue. Now, the National Women's Party, led by Alice and her friends, decided that it wasn't enough to simply ask for the right to vote. They were going to demand it, and they were going to confront the politicians, people like Wilson, okay? And they were going to do a number of protests of various kinds that would kind of, give Wilson something to think about at least, and give him a bad time. And over time, their level of militancy, as you'll see, increases. Probably the most famous thing they did initially, of course, in 1913 and early 1913, was the famous parade. If you've seen Iron Jawed Angels, you've seen the parade, where women actually upstaged Wilson. He came into town for his big inaugural, and the women were all having a parade, and everybody was watching them, okay? They're going to keep doing other things like that, okay? In November 1913, Lucy Burns, who our museum is named for, did something else that was considered to be very radical. She actually chalked the sidewalk in front of the White House, votes for women, that sort of thing. Now, this, you're not supposed to chalk this, you're still not supposed to chalk the White House sidewalk, my dears. She was arrested, and she was brought into court, and the judge said, well, ma'am, that'll be $250. And Lucy said, oh, I don't have that kind of money. So they made a deal. Lucy agreed never to chalk the White House sidewalk again, and she only had to pay $1. But she's sort of the first, the first sort of radical suffragist to get a lot of attention from people in DC. That made all the papers, even made the New York Times. So anyway, Wilson met with the National Women's Party leaders. He invited them into the White House. Didn't get along too well. Alice and her friends were not particularly deferential. They were not particularly willing to just listen to him go on. And he didn't like that, because to him, again, you got to remember, he's a good Southern boy from Virginia, okay? And women are not supposed to get in his face. So anyway, now, in 1916, women's historian Mary Beard wrote that she and her friends had decided that without that national amendment, women here in the South would never get to vote. So she believed it was critical that we get a national amendment, which Wilson opposed, okay? To give you an idea of what Mrs. Beard and her friends were talking about, in case you're wondering, she's Charles Beard's wife. And some professors I had actually thought she had more on the ball than he did, but that's another whole story, okay? Virginia General Assembly, before 1916, actually voted women's suffrage down 3 times, and it wasn't even close. So this is what Mrs. Beard and her friends are concerned about. And that's one of the things that's going to motivate Alice and her friends to do what they do. Now, the thing that really sort of pushes us towards picketing and the rest of our story is the death in 1916 in November of Inez Milholland. Inez was a very prominent suffragist. You've all seen her on her horse. If you've seen Iron Jawed Angels, or if you've seen pictures of Suffrage, there she is with Grey Dawn. That's her horse. And actually, she was a very accomplished horsewoman. And in addition to her work for suffrage, and she appeared in other parades too, by the way, Inez also was an attorney. She was a big opponent of the death penalty, so she was involved in a number of those cases. And she also was a big supporter of women, working women, and their issues. In fact, she got in big trouble in 1909. There was a big strike, textile strike up in New York City, and she was actually driving some of the strikers around in her little roadster, and the cops arrested her. Okay, so she was involved in a number of causes, and suffrage was just one of them. The problem with that is Inez tends to burn the candle at both ends. She's always going, if you read her biography, she's always here with this case, here with that case, here with women's suffrage, and then going across to England to see her friends in England. She came from a very wealthy family, and that was not all that uncommon. Okay. Now, in 1916, Alice decided to send a train full of envoys from the east, from Washington, all the way out to the West Coast. Why? A lot of the states in the West already let women vote. And what Alice wanted her speakers, like Inez, to do was to appeal to the women voters to support people in their states who would also support women's suffrage, who would come to Washington and help push it in Congress. And so she actually, as I said, got a group of women, including Inez, to go out west. Now, the problem with this was by this time, Inez was in bad health. As I said, Inez didn't take very good care of herself. She had very, very, very rotten tonsils. And back then, folks, they didn't have any penicillin. Today, you got tonsillitis, they give you penicillin or something like that. Back then, no. Plus, she was extremely anemic. She collapsed while she was speaking in California, in LA. She wound up in the hospital, and she never left the hospital. And she died on, let me get the right date here for you. She died on November 25th in 1916. Now, Alice and her friends, the National Women's Party, saw this as an opportunity. They could play on people's sympathy for Inez's death. They held a big public ceremony, although they got into a fight with Inez's dad because he didn't want them parading his daughter's body around. He made that very clear to them. And he thought that's what Alice and her buddies wanted to do. So, National Women's Party passed a resolution calling on President Wilson to support a federal amendment for suffrage in honor of Inez, in honor of her memory. They met with Wilson on January 9th, 1917. It didn't go well. Wilson said, "I'm sorry your friend died," and then left the room. The women were furious, and they decided, okay, that's it. We've had it. And so the next day, they had a big meeting over at Cameron House, which is right behind the White House. Next day, Alice Paul, there's Alice. Alice always looks like, she's such a nice little person. She's not. And usually she's got her big baggy coat on too, but I couldn't find a good picture with her with the big baggy coat on. So she and another one of her supporters, Harriet Stanton Blatch, they got together and they decided, okay, we're going to do something nobody's ever done before. If you're wondering, why does this woman look familiar? There's her mom. Okay, her mom's Elizabeth Cady Stanton, so that's why they kind of look at familiar to you. All right, at the time that the women are trying to push Wilson, you can see that most of the Western states, most of the Western states have already given women the right to vote. And it's the East, and particularly the South, where it's not happening. In some places, you can see there in the Midwest, they allowed women to vote in local elections. This was this partial suffrage, maybe vote for the mayor, vote for the school board, things like that. but not for the federal offices. Okay, so now, so what they decide to do, Alice and her friends, is they decide to picket the White House. Nobody's ever done that before. This is a newie. Okay, think about that in the context of today. Somebody's always picketing the White House, right? Several somebody's often are. And so they come out on January 10th, 1917, with a number of protesters that are carrying banners. One of them is what becomes known as the Milholland Banner. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? The woman that's carrying the banner is Allison Hopkins. Her husband, you love this, was the man who helped Woodrow Wilson get reelected. He helped Wilson raise money. They were both from New Jersey. In fact, Mrs. Hopkins and her husband had recently been to dinner in the White House. Okay. Now, so here we go. We're going to come out with our banners. We're going to go and stand for the White House. And we've become known as the Silent Sentinels. And there they all are. Okay. They've got the banner that I showed you earlier, the purple, white, and gold banner. Okay. And they're standing in front of Cameron House there. And they're going to go over and stand by the White House fence. Yeah, there they are. And at first, people didn't really see them as a problem. They brought them coffee. They brought them cocoa. In some cases, they brought them donuts or something because it wasn't seen as a big deal. Okay. And so the big deal becomes when the United States enters the First World War. Okay. Wilson actually invited the women into tea, but they said no, they didn't really want his tea. I mean, remember, he's a good Southern boy. And the other thing that's interesting that you'll see, particularly when we get to the more radical things, is the women often quote Wilson's words back at him in their banners. Wilson talks a lot once we get into World War I about making the world safe for democracy. And the women say, we don't even have democracy here. What are you talking about, you hypocrite? Anyway, so now once we get involved in World War I, a lot of people thought the women should just go home. Okay, just go home, wait till the war was over. Alice said, it's not happening. Really, it's not happening. That's what women had done during the Civil War, and no, they did not get the vote then. So Alice's attitude is, you're not going to fool us again. Sorry. So here we are. The Secret Service and what became the FBI, what was then called the Bureau of Investigation, looked into the women, looked into their backgrounds. They didn't really find anybody that was really dangerous. They did find a few socialists, but they were from New York, and my dears, they're still socialists from New York. In fact, you could probably vote in a socialist primary when they have the New York primaries. But anyway, the mobs began to harass the women, though, particularly when they changed their banners, and take the banners away from them and things like that. Now, let's talk a little bit about the pickets. It's estimated by historians there were about 2,000 women that picketed. About 500 were arrested, okay, actually taken into custody and booked, okay. About 168 were jailed in Occoquan in DC, or a few up in Boston, okay. There's a protest in Boston when Wilson comes back from Europe and they arrest some women there. 72 of them served time in Occoquan. So that's what we focus on at the Lucy Burns Museum. We know that there was at least one black picket. This is Mary Church Tarrow. She was a local DC activist. She was very active in civil rights. She taught at the Black High School, and she also worked at Howard. In fact, she helped found Delta Sigma Theta sorority, and those ladies actually marched in that famous parade. She did too, by the way, in 1913. She stopped picketing when the cops let Alice know that they were going to start arresting people. She probably figured, oh, you'll see what happens to the white pickets. You can see why Mrs. Terrell decided, well, that's not going to happen to me. All right, here's Wilson and the protesters. He comes out for a walk, and the women are there with their various signs. Okay, so And I'm looking to see, I don't see Lucy. I know there's one picture where Lucy's in it. Yeah, here's Lucy right here. And so the trouble started in June when the women introduced what was known as the Russia banner. In the Russia banner, the Russian ambassador had come to DC to visit the president. And Lucy and this is Catherine Morey, the other lady, were displaying a banner that basically accused Wilson of being a hypocrite. Wilson talked a lot about democracy, make the world safe for democracy when we declared war. And Lucy and Catherine and all the other suffragists are saying, we don't have it here. So what are you talking about? So when they arrested Lucy and Catherine, this is another banner that gets everybody in trouble, the Kaiser Wilson banner. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but let me go forward. Yeah, here's Lucy and Catherine. I love this picture of Catherine. Catherine is there. She's been arrested and she's in custody. She doesn't look like she's terribly worried, does she? She's like, yeah, whatever. Okay. Here are people, again, the arrests. Okay. And one of the people that we know was picked up and arrested but not jailed was a lady from Alexandria, Mary Morse Lockwood. We'll say more about her later. Okay. She was the leader of the National Women's Party up in Alexandria. I'll say more about her later because she does some interesting things. Okay. Now, in the DC jail, before they start sending them to Occoquan, sometimes they didn't have enough room for them. They slept out on the floor, in the stones. It was cold. It was nasty. I mean, the DC jail was the reason they opened the workhouse. And it was because the DC jail was nasty, just like it is today. All right, now. So, on July 4th, for example, 11 women were arrested. And they were kept in the DC jail where, believe it or not, they sang, which annoyed the officials. The women were told that if they kept walking, they did not stop, they were okay. They stopped, they were blocking the sidewalk and they could be arrested. That's nonsense, but we'll talk about that later. By mid-July, the DC authorities decided it was time to get tough with the ladies and send them to the Occoquan workhouse. And there it is. This is what the original workhouse looked like. It's over where the water treatment plant is today, on the other side of the road from the museum. It was built of wooden buildings, and that's it. Okay. This was later, most of it was replaced. Not all of it was replaced in the 1930s when they built brick buildings. So anyway, so as I said, this is what the women's workhouse looked like. It's interesting. There's a pharmacy up in Occoquan that published its own postcards. This was actually a postcard. And I've got one in a little later on of the men's workhouse. We laugh, we say we ought to sell these at our museum, saying, something like, wish you were here on them or something like that. The women's workhouse opened in 1912. The whole workhouse idea was seen as a progressive era effort. People were taken out of DC. They were in the fresh air. They worked. The women did things like the laundry, they did sewing, whatever. And as I said, the women were housed in these wooden dormitories. Most of the women that were here at the workhouse, at the women's workhouse, were only there for maybe 2 or 3 months. Okay, these are short-term prisoners. And there were no cells here, which you'll see later on why that's important. So before the arrival of the suffrage prisoners in August, September, and October, the women's workhouse averaged about 30 to 40 inmates a month. The majority of them were Black women. Most were women who were picked up for pickpocketing, being drunk, as bootleggers, shoplifters, or there were some who were prostitutes, yes. For the brief time before the suffrage prisoners were at Occoquan, they actually pushed the inmate totals over 100, which was a bit of a problem. That was really stretching the resources here, but that's what Alice and her friends wanted. They wanted to give everybody a hard time. So from July to November, 17 women were sent to the women's workhouse in an effort to separate them from Alice. Alice served her 1 term in the DC jail. Okay. At the workhouse, they'd wear prison clothing, which was not nice. It's old-fashioned mattress ticking, the blue and white striped stuff. And often it was not clean. They had to eat prison food, which was also not nice. They slept in cold rooms on unclean bedding. Yeah, there weren't any cells here, so these were kind of like big. Most of these were kind of partitioned off as big, like almost like dormitories or army barracks, if you're familiar with army barracks. Prison officials hassled them. Oh, this is the director of the workhouse, or the superintendent, Mr. Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker's not happy with these ladies. He wished they'd shut up and leave him alone, if you want to know the truth. And at one point, Whitaker and his buddies actually used the African-American women to harass and intimidate the suffragists, telling them to rough them up a little bit. They also placed the suffragists in the same dormitories next to the black women. Now, it's interesting how the white women reacted to this. They didn't react very well. When you read what they said, you're like, oh dear. It was very clear they were very uncomfortable around these black women. And they also were kind of condescending in the things that they said about them. So when I've had people come to the museum, people said, yeah, they had their white privilege on, didn't they? The suffragists tried to insist they were political prisoners and they deserved better treatment, they said. A few women paid the fine. Now, if you didn't want to go down to Occoquan, you could pay a $25 fine. But a lot of women said, no, we didn't do anything wrong, we're not paying it. Remember, Alice is a good Quaker girl. Quakers don't pay fines, so that's what she's telling her people. Two women, Annie Chisholm and Bertha Jackson, had their fines paid by their husbands and were released. Other women's husbands and relatives tried to pay their fines, but often the women said, no, you're not doing that. I'm sorry. The first suffrage prisoners sent to Occoquan were sent after they were arrested on July 14th, good old Bastille Day, okay? They'd been sentenced to Occoquan for 60 days. They included Allison Hopkins, whose husband was, of course, good friends with Wilson. Supposedly, Mr. Hopkins went over to the White House and said, do you have any idea where my wife is? And Wilson played dumb. Oh, no, 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 no. You know how politicians are. And Mr. Hopkins said, how would you like it if your wife was in the workhouse like mine is, with the drunks, the druggies, the prostitutes, etc., etc.? Okay. Wilson kind of, had to say, oh, I didn't know, blah, 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 blah. And basically, Wilson had to back off, had to back down, pardon the women. Mr. Hopkins, his lawyers, his friends, all rode down in their cars to the Occoquan workhouse, picked up their women and went back to DC. Okay. After the White House pickets displayed their Kaiser Wilson banners in August, more women were sent to the workhouse. The Kaiser Wilson banners compared the president to the Kaiser of Germany. Not nice, right? They served, there were women who were sent for 30 or 60 days, and they served their full sentences, okay? Authorities also began to confiscate the banners, tearing them away from the women. On August 14th, for example, 22 banners and 12 flags, those are the purple, white, and gold things, were destroyed. The following days, 50 flags were on August 16th, 56 Kaiser Wilson banners were taken. There are no Kaiser Wilson banners still in existence, unless there's one in somebody's grandmother's trunk, okay? And if it is, we hope they tell us. The Smithsonian is kind of the authority on that, but they say they've never found any, so, but they've never found Alice's famous banner either. But the women kept turning out these banners. There was a room, kind of like a sewing room, where Lucy kept everybody sewing and turning out banners. From what we know, they used to stencil for some of it, and in other cases, they embroidered things, because a lot of these women were very skilled in embroidering. 13 additional women were sent to Occoquan after they protested on Labor Day. It was a parade honoring draftees on Labor Day, and people like Pauline Adams, Pauline is from Norfolk, showed up and disrupted the parade. They got 60 days. They said in their banners, as mothers of draftees, they didn't like the fact they didn't get to vote. They thought that was wrong. They're sending our sons overseas and we have no say in it. These are the first people, the ladies who were sent down here after that, are the first ones to declare themselves political prisoners. On October 21st, they were actually, most of them returned to the DC jail because there were no cells for them in women's workhouse. Okay. Lucy was part of that group, and that was her first time that she'd gone to Occoquan, but not the last. Now in October, Alice decided it was her turn to get arrested. You know how political leaders are. Here's Alice coming out with her banner, and they grabbed her before she even got to the White House fence, and Alice wound up in the DC jail. They kept her awake. They shined flashlights in her eyes. They did all kinds of stuff like that. They tried to convince her she was crazy, and they kept threatening to put her over in St. Elizabeth's. But Alice is tough. All these ladies are tough. And basically, again, these ladies are not going to back down, no matter what people say. Now, Alice decided she was going on a hunger strike. She went on a hunger strike. She wouldn't eat. They force fed her. When word of all this got out to her followers, they staged a massive protest on November 14th, and they arrested 31 women that day. They were brought down to Occoquan. Lucy Burns actually served a sentence of 6 months, and the woman who got the shortest term was Mary Nolan. Mary was 73, and the judge was very reluctant to sentence her to a long period of time because she was very frail. She only got 6 days. When the women arrived here we go, we demand that the government treat Alice Paul as a political offender. And anyway, there's Mary. Mary was 73. She's from Florida, and she gets 6 days. When they're brought down here, the women refuse to cooperate at all. They won't take their clothes off. They won't put prison clothes on. They do a lot of other things that are considered to be kind of naughty. They won't give their names. They're all Jane Does and Jane Roes. Okay. And so what Mr. Whitaker decides, he's had enough of these women. He brings his guards in and he drags about 33 of them across the road to the men's workhouse. This is the original men's workhouse. It's also built of wood. I'm calling your attention to this picture because if you look over here in the right side, you'll see, here we are, 3 small buildings. Those are the places they brought the women. Those are a series of cell blocks. One of the first things built of brick in Occoquan, and they brought the women over there. That's where they kept men who were recovering from alcoholism. So the men were singing and screaming and crying and probably beating their heads against the wall and doing all kinds of whacked out things. And women are thrown in there. And they were thrown pretty roughly too. Here's another shot of the cell block. Okay. This is what the outside of the cell looked like. The women were, as I said, brought across. They were thrown in the cells. Some of them were beaten, kicked, whatever. They left Lucy Burns, who wouldn't shut up. Lucy's not good at that. Tied up to her cell door. She was trying to make sure everybody was okay. Mary Nolan reported that she was thrown around and it injured her leg, which was a problem anyway, even more. Dora Lewis, one of the other leaders, was thrown into her cell. She hit her head and she wound up with a concussion. So they were not very gentle with these women. There's Dora. I love the hats a lot of these women have, all these flowers on them. Anyway. Okay. So the next morning, after the night of terrors, Mary Nolan called it, they began to move the women around. Some of them went back over to women's prison. Some of them stayed at the men's prison. Mrs. Butterworth, no, she's not the pancake lady. Her husband's an accountant. Okay. Mrs. Butterworth was actually taken to one of the men's dormitories and left there. Did anything happen? Nobody ever said anything, so we can't be sure. Okay. The women went on a hunger strike because of their treatment. The men who were running the workhouse tried to get them to eat. They tempted them with baked apples, with fried chicken. I always laugh about that because Most of these ladies are from up north. They don't eat fried chicken. Okay, they really don't. And one of the hunger strikers looked out the window, and she said she noticed a rabbit just kind of hopping around there, and she thought about how wonderful it would taste. Yeah, rabbit's good if you've done it right. Okay. On October 19th, the officials decided to force feed. Now, this is British. We have no pictures of anything here. This is a British drawing, okay, of force feeding. Decided to force feed Lucy and Dora. We're now leading the hunger strike. Three other women, Alice, Rose Winslow, and Kate Heffelfinger, were also force fed, but they were force fed at the DC jail. Okay. Dora and Lucy were in such bad shape after they were force fed, they were actually moved to the DC prison hospital because they didn't react well to this. Basically, Lucy wouldn't open her mouth. Lucy's a bad girl. She won't open her mouth. And so what happened was they stuck the tube down her nose and poured eggs, raw eggs and milk down into her stomach. It's nasty. Dora said she just threw hers up. And they also messed up their sinuses too when they did this to them. So back in DC, the National Women's Party leaders wanted to know what was going on. They went over this train station to see who would tell them things. Mary Nolan brought back information. Remember, she only got 6 days. She came home, swore out an affidavit, and told everybody what was going on. And then one of the women's attorneys, Mr. O'Brien, got in to see Lucy, and she told him what was going on too. Okay. All of this started leaking out. The president looked like a creep. And these are respectable women. They're wealthy. They can afford really, good lawyers, that sort of thing. And the attorneys began to put pressure on the president. Wilson at first said, oh, the usual, I don't know what's going on. Eventually, the women's attorneys got their case taken to the federal courthouse in Alexandria before Judge Edmund Woodill. Judge Woodill issued a writ of habeas corpus. The women had to be brought up. And Mr. Whitaker just doesn't learn. He actually tried to avoid having the subpoena served. He went and hid in various places down here in Fairfax. So here's Dora Lewis after they released her to go to court. She had to be assisted by her friends because she was in such rotten shape. And when the women came into Judge Woodill's courthouse, everybody was shocked at how bad they were off. Some of them hadn't eaten, some of them been, beaten up, whatever. And some of them just kind of flopped down and went back to sleep on the benches in the court. Judge Woodill wanted to know what was going on. He read all the paperwork. He talked to the women. And then he noticed in part of the paperwork that the women weren't supposed to be at Occoquan. According to Dorothy Day, there's Dorothy, when she was young. I usually see pictures of Dorothy when she was old. This is when she was young, and she was actually actually a journalist at that point before she became a Catholic nun. What Dorothy told us in her memoir is that they went over to the DC jail and somebody came out and told them to take the women down to Occoquan. So that's how they wound up at Occoquan. And the judge just said, no, Judge Woodill said, that's not happening anymore. He ruled in late November, women could not be sent to Occoquan for anything like this anymore. Okay. They could not be sent down there as suffrage prisoners. The women were released from jail and they all went back to Cameron House. And from what we've read, they had a big party. These ladies liked their champagne, so they had lots of champers and were very happy. Alice, here's the women being released from the DC jail. I think that's Lucy. Okay. And if I had a chance and had some pictures, I could probably figure out who a lot of these other ladies were. But anyway, so Alice and Alva Belmont, as in Belmont Steaks, as in Belmont Park in New York, she's very wealthy, came up with the idea of designing a special pin for the people who had been jailed, the jail door pin. This was given out at the ceremony in the Velasco Theater, which was right near Cameron House. And also Alice hired, and they had these for the pickets too. Without extinction is liberty. Anyway, basically there were other protests, by the way. On August 6th, which was Inez's birthday in 1918, a group of women went out and protested on the Lafayette statue behind the White House. They were arrested because the Park Service doesn't want you climbing on their statues. They still don't. Okay. And then in 1919, while Wilson was away in France, the women staged what they called their Watchfires protest, where they're doing their burning his speeches. It's like, again, you're a hypocrite, Wilson. Get your act together. Okay. So there's Lucy Burns in the DC jail. You all see this picture. This was taken at the DC jail. It was not taken at Occoquan. You know, Lucy looks so, again, like Alice, so innocent. Yeah, right. This is the DC jail that was reopened for the suffragists in 1918 and 1919. And Alice also hired something called the prison special in 1919 to tour the country. And here they all are. They made themselves or got somebody to make them things that looked like the dresses they had to wear. You can see them all. I think that's, again, I think that's Lucy right there. And these ladies are all kind of waving their flags. They don't look like they're really, upset about things, let's put it that way. And, they went around and told everybody about what had happened to them. I love this picture. It was taken in Syracuse, which is not too far where I'm from. This is Louisiane Havemeyer and Vita Mulholland. That's Inez's sister. Louisiane Havemeyer was good friends with Mary Cassatt's, and Mary actually painted this picture with her. Okay, and she helped Mrs. Havemeyer figure out what to get. Mrs. Havemeyer collected art, and Mary Cassatt helped her figure out what to do. I would show people this picture because I tell them the cop that's in there. The cop, my great-grandfather's brother, George, was a policeman in Syracuse. So I was joking and say this is George P. But anyway, all right. Well, after the courts, and by the way, the courts tossed out the women's convictions, and Whitaker was, quote unquote, forced to retire. I'm sure you know people that's happened to. Supposedly the suffragists cheered when they heard that he'd been forced to retire. Picketing is free speech, my dears. It's protected by the First Amendment. Wilson decided after everything happened here to support women's suffrage. He also recognized that American women did a lot to support the war effort. Okay, World War I. So in 1918, he announced he would support the National Federal Amendment. Congress, or the House, passed it in 1918. The Senate passed it in 1919. And it went out to the states to be ratified. It needed 36 states out of 48 to be ratified. Remember, Hawaii and Alaska aren't there yet. The one region that resisted, of course, was the South. Here in Virginia, we voted it down twice, being Virginia. And Tennessee provided the breakthrough, though. On August 20th, 1920, a young legislator named Harry Byrne changed his vote at the last minute after he got a letter from his mom. His mom wrote him a letter, and in it she said, "Be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat with the rats with ratification." And Harry later on said, "Well, I always think it's a good idea to take advice from your mother." So anyway, with the necessary 36 states, the amendment became part of the Constitution. There's Alice. She sewed a star on the flag for each state that ratified. And here they are in August, displaying it off the balcony at their place, all standing around and cheering. Okay. Many southern states like Virginia, however, did not go along. And they went along. They didn't have any choice. They had to let women vote, but they came up with all kinds of restrictions like poll taxes, literacy tests, etc. There were a number of prominent women suffragists that were Black. I've already mentioned Mary Church Terrell. This is Ida Wells. You've probably seen her again in the movie Iron-Jawed Angels. And here in Virginia, in Richmond, we had Magdalena Walker. Mrs. Walker owned a bank. She was very wealthy. She paid other women's poll taxes. She helped them pass literacy tests. And at one point, when she discovered that the authorities in Richmond were making the Black women wait down in the cellar of the courthouse and ignoring them, she went down there and raised holy you-know-what and helped Black women get registered. So again, other women were restricted too. Other women of color, people like Virginia Indian women, Chinese women, other Asian women, Hispanic women in certain places, all found out they could not vote. So it's not, a lot of those women were not allowed to vote until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed by Congress, and also the 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes. So now I'm going to end up really quickly talking about suffrage here in Alexandria for you folks. One of the leaders of the suffrage movement actually in Virginia was a very famous Alexandria woman, Dr. Kate Waller Barrett. She's the person that your library is named for. She organized a chapter of the Equal Suffrage League, which was the more moderate of the suffrage groups in Alexandria. She was there when they founded the statewide one in Richmond. Again, she was known for her more moderate approaches to it. And I know this doesn't show up with the you-know-what, but there's actually a wonderful book. It's called The Campaign for Women's Suffrage in Virginia. And you can see all the chapters of the Equal Suffrage League, okay? There are a bunch of them up in Fairfax and also in Alexandria and Arlington. There's one in Prince William. I assume it's Manassas, but then there's nothing in Stafford. Who knows what was going on in Stafford, but you can see a number of places where there were a bunch of chapters. So anyway. Mary Morris Hall Lockwood started out in the Equal Suffrage League, but she decided that it wasn't moving fast enough. And so she joined the National Women's Party when Alice Paul came to Virginia to recruit people. She organized the chapter in Alexandria, and she worked with other NWP leaders in Virginia, like Sophie Meredith, who was the Virginia president. She's from Richmond, and Pauline Adams, who was from Norfolk. They actually drove up to DC in a car all covered with banners, suffrage banners, and she organized a number of fundraising activities there as well. She was picked up for picketing in 1917, but she never wound up getting convicted, so she didn't go to jail. In 1921, after women had the right to vote, she actually ran for delegate on the Republican ticket, but she lost.